Big topics, big stories, and big news. The Big Rich Show. It happens here. November 22nd, 1963. The assassination of John F. Kennedy. The cast of characters is large. Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, Lyndon B. Johnson, Fidel Castro, the KGB, and the notorious Warren Commission. 57 years later, do these puzzle pieces still fit together? Join myself and Wayne Hudgins as we take a look back and re-examine and theory-craft this day in American history.
JFK's assassination immediately triggered suspicion.
Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
The 91 Oliver Stone film JFK depicted government agents as conspirators in the assassination.
The guy couldn't do the shooting. Nobody could. And they sold this lemon to the American public.
1 year later, Bush Sr. signed into law the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act, which requires all records from the assassination be publicly disclosed in full no later than 25 years after the date of enactment of the act. Side note, a government report credits Stone's film with the passage of the act, saying, Americans could not trust official public conclusions when those conclusions had been made in secret.
President Trump tweeting this morning, JFK files are being carefully released. In the end, there will be great transparency. It is my hope to get just about everything to public. The documents capture the frantic days after the assassination when federal agents madly chased after tips, juggled rumors, and followed leads worldwide. One memo says a British newspaper received an anonymous call about big news in the United States 25 minutes before Kennedy was shot in Dallas. The files could take weeks to sift through, but not all of them were released.
The National Archives has released 2,800 records related to John F. Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963. The White House and President Trump decided to delay the release of tens of thousands of more pages. But we did find interesting papers that increase our understanding of the immediate aftermath of the assassination and how the CIA operated back in the 1960s. The first document that we found that was really intriguing was a memo that J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, wrote 2 days after the assassination. The memo is 3 pages long, but it finally ends with a hint of secrecy. Hoover writes, "The thing I am concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." Conspiracy theorists could read a lot into that memo. Although it's pretty clear by now that the government has long believed that Oswald was the lone gunman in Dealey Plaza, it's tantalizing to think that Hoover, in real time, was trying to force the issue, was trying to say, we need to make Oswald the lone assassin. The second most interesting document we could find was a report made in 1975 by President Gerald Ford's general counsel. It was a report on the CIA's assassination attempts over the previous decade. The report described a Pentagon-proposed plan called Operation Bounty, in which leaflets would be dropped by air into Cuba, trying to entice Cubans to kill or capture leaders of Castro's government, including Castro himself. Their reward would be money. And the report actually spells out how much money the Cubans would get. Up to $100,000 for government officials, $97,000 for foreign communist leaders, and $57,000 for department heads. For Castro himself, perhaps for symbolic reasons, just 2 cents. The third most interesting document that we could find was a deposition that the legendary former CIA director Richard Helms gave in 1975, answering questions to the Commission on CIA Activities. And at one point, the attorney turned to Helms and asked him point blank whether the CIA had any involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy. Well now, the final area of my investigation relates to charges that the CIA was in some way conspiratorially involved with the assassination of President Kennedy. During the time of the Warren Commission, you were Deputy Director of Plans, is that correct? And Helms replies, I believe so. But then the attorney asked him, is there any information involved with the assassination of President Kennedy which in any way shows that Lee Harvey Oswald was in some way a CIA agent or an agent, and then the document just cuts off. And we don't have the rest of the deposition. We'd love to know what the remaining portions say of the deposition. I suspect that Helms denied the assertion or the allegation that the CIA had any involvement in the assassination or that it had recruited Oswald as an asset. But it still would have been interesting to see Helms' denial and how he framed the sentences, the words he chose.
And welcome to the Big Rich Show, guys. Tonight, we're going to get deep into the JFK conspiracy world. And I have all the way across the pond in Germany, a friend that I met here in the United States, Wayne Hudgins. And Wayne is not a professional, but he has the burning desire to dig deep into conspiracy theories. Wayne, it's good to have you, brother.
Hi, Rich. Thanks for having me on the show. It's good to see you again. It's been a while, huh?
Yeah, it's been a couple of months, man.
Yeah, I enjoyed meeting you there at the Boo on Bell at Halloween there in Shawnee, and I look forward to the conversation tonight.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You were one of probably a handful of people that I actually met at Boo on Bell that just captivated my mind. I mean, it was towards the end of the evening, the last day, here comes this guy walking up, and I'm like, oh man, I've dealt with a lot of crazies today. I've dealt with a lot of cool people, but you just came up, man, and you were dropping knowledge on my cranium, and it was just like, and it was almost, I mean, we talked for probably a solid hour. We could have went into the wee hours of the night. I mean, they were making us break down. So I was like, dude, I want to keep going and talking with you, man. But they're telling us we got to break the tent down. So yeah, it was amazing, man. I loved it. And now I got you on the show, and you're going to talk, and I'm going to talk about something that a lot of people are passionate about, man. And it's still relevant in 2020. And, that's the kind of the whodunit of the JFK assassination or murder. There's so many theories, and I love the way you present it. You want to tell the people a little bit about maybe how you do your research and a little about you as far as not being professional, but your desire and for truth?
Sure, Rich. Really, I guess this all really started for me. I was young. This had to have been 1988 on NBC. A little broadcast came on. It was called 4 Days in November. And it was an insight over the 4 days that happened over the Kennedy assassination. I remember it very well. I was at my great aunt's house. My mother was there, and we were all just glued to the television watching this. So I guess I would have been about 11 years old at this time, and must have been maybe about 3 years later or so, I got my hands on my first Bill Cooper VHS cassette tape. And once you see Bill Cooper, if you know who Bill Cooper is, I mean, you know that you are somewhere down deep in the rabbit hole. Oh, yeah. And then ever since then, any kind of, we can say, conspiracy theory or things that are supposed to be hidden from the public have interested me very much. And every year around November, I'll do a kind of a 2-week remembrance of John F. Kennedy and watch as many documentaries as I can and read as much as I can. And especially in the last 10, 15 years since the YouTube revolution, I mean, the access to information is just wonderful. I mean, you can basically, pop an earbud in your ear at nighttime, listen to a documentary as you're going to sleep, and just, the information is just wonderful. So every year I do this little 2-week memorial and And here we go. I contacted you, or we got in contact at the Buon Bell there, and thought, here's something that we could definitely talk about. And, one of the things that you said is that, this is something that's still relevant. When I was talking to my wife about this, my wife's an East German, so, this is not something that affects her political life as much as it does mine as an American. But she says, who cares? And, that's really the reason that we should keep talking about this, because it's so important. Because in my opinion, in 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, this was a coup d'etat. I mean, this is the day that the military-industrial complex took over the United States government. And these
Absolutely.
are the guys that are still in charge. And this is why it's important to talk about this, Rich.
Absolutely. Well, and what's also, to me, important, and I'm glad you brought that up, is we're almost experiencing the same thing without the assassination right now, currently with Trump. It's almost like they're trying to force impeach, like a coup, like a takeover right now. And I don't think it's so much the left, but the lefts are the puppets that are being used by the background, or what they call the deep state. So I don't know. That's why I think it'll be a great show as well, because we're kind of witnessing some madness going on now with the government, with almost a coup. So
yeah, it's a funny thing is you look through history, you kind of see that, history has a way of repeating itself, and these things run in cycles. And, and instead of thinking it this way, I kind of see it as, oh, wait a minute. I think I've seen this movie before. Maybe the names were different, the location was different, a couple of different characters, but it seems to be, it's the same guys that are in charge doing the same thing. But I do kind of feel is that Trump was a little bit of an unexpected thing from the military-industrial complex. We'll call these guys, some guys call them the New World Order, some guys call them the Illuminati, but I would definitely say that Hillary would have progressed this military-industrial complex Illuminati agenda without as much fight as they do have with Trump. So I do think Trump is a little bit of a problem for some people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, he's the wild card, man. This is a guy that's never had to take no as an answer his entire life, multi-billionaire. He wasn't a politician. He was a shrewd businessman. And he was upfront, in your face. I mean, I did a little video I'll be releasing in a few weeks where I talk about that. I said, people, they seem to forget, Trump has been in the public's eye for 30 years, 30, 40 years, on TV shows, sitcoms, the news, rappers. He's mentioned over 300 times by 30 different rappers as this, monopoly man, God, that they want to have his kind of money. But now they all hate him that he's president. But this is the same guy they were worshiping 20 years ago and writing about in their rap songs. And now they're, against him, because all of a sudden now he's this evil, dictator that wants to just control everybody in the US. And it's just funny how things flip like that. But let's stick to this here, the JFK. And I like the way you approached it. And do you want to lead in with, we're going to give you a different view tonight, fans, is what I'm saying. We're not going to give you the old typical, from the grassy knoll, or, da-da-da-da. Wayne dug deep and got some meat that I think is very relevant. And I like the way he approached it. So we're going to kind of start with the 1960 election, and we can go from there.
Sure. 1960, one of the things that's really difficult for me, I'm 42 years old, so I wasn't alive when Kennedy was assassinated. But I talked to my mom a lot about the time that this happened. She was alive, and she tells me these great stories of being in school and having these nuclear bomb drills. They would hide underneath their desks, this duck and cover campaign that the American propaganda machine ran. And America at this point in time, leading up into some things that come a little bit later, this was a scary time for America. We had the revolution in Cuba was happening, where Castro was taking over. So, you know, there were a lot of things going on in 1960. So Eisenhower's leaving office. So the election of 1960 starts off on the Democratic side, you have Johnson against Kennedy. Johnson is a very powerful man in Washington. He's the, maybe you can help me here, the Senate Majority Leader.
Right, yes.
So, you know, one of the top 10, top 15 most powerful guys in Washington. He thought he was a shoo-in. I think he might have underestimated the power of the Kennedy money a little bit. But the fact of it is that they were bitter rivals. It went through the primaries, and Kennedy emerges 2-1,
right.
800 to 400 votes to put Kennedy on as the Democratic presidential nomination.
Yep. You know what I found interesting too, and this is from you before you go on, is that one of the interesting things that I had never really delved into is Johnson, there's documented case. I mean, he blackmailed his way into that position, you know, to be able to be the main candidate for the Democrats.
He did indeed. We all know that J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson were very good friends. And J. Edgar Hoover was a very powerful man, the head of the FBI. And basically, he had a file on everybody. Kennedy had already announced Stevenson as his, I might be wrong about that, I believe Stevenson is who he had chosen to be his vice presidential candidate. And just a few days before the announcement, Johnson shows up in Kennedy's office with a nice dossier of documents, pictures, and says, you know, you might be president, but you won't be president long. Once this gets out, I'd like to be the vice president. So, of course, Kennedy had absolutely no choice but to put Johnson on the ticket.
Right, right, yeah. It's crazy, isn't it?
You know, I'm sure this kind of thing goes on all the time in Washington.
Oh yeah, you absolutely. Everyone's being greased, and hopefully, you know, that's why a lot of people were happy when Trump was like, "Oh, I'm going to drain the swamp." It'll never happen. He might get rid of some of the rats, but there's so much money being exchanged hand to hand from congressmen and senators to big corporations.
You know, Rich, we had this big hope when Obama was elected that there was going to be some kind of a change. And then we had 8 years of pretty much the same thing, stimulus packages for the banks. And then now we have Trump coming in and say, oh, this is going to be a businessman. Now we're going to have a different approach. It's not going to be the same guys doing the same things. And you're halfway right. It's the same stuff is still happening, but the reason that Trump rubs so many people wrong is that he's brought in his own peoples to start doing this business now.
Right.
This is one of the things, you know, that where Trump gets a lot of feedback. He's disrupting the financial, military, industrial complex system by implanting his own people, instead of the de facto people who have been there since the 60s.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. You're exactly right. He's like, it's almost like he's saying, "Hey, man, you know what? If you guys have been getting paid all these years, and this is what's going on, I'm going to bring my people in, and we're going to do it. You know, I'm not going to use who you tell me." And yeah, I think that's really rubbing them the wrong way.
Absolutely. I'm a small business owner here in Germany, and I would love to have a government contract, Rich. I would love to have a government contract.
No doubt. No doubt. I bet you would. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous, the amounts of money. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, Kennedy and Johnson and with him being elected. And then we're going to move kind of into, I guess, the explosion with all the new tech that was going on, you know, what the political climate was like, and the actual rise of the military industrial complex. Do you want to touch a little on some of that?
Sure. You know, one of the first times we heard about this was when Eisenhower was making his farewell address to the nation. He gets in office and he basically tells us, you know, America, watch out. We have this huge military industrial complex, and the idea is make as much money as possible. The best way to make this money is through war. I mean, basically, I mean, how much more clear can you be about what's going on here? And like you said, you know, this is the 1960s, you know, and we have this huge technology explosion. You have the rockets, the missiles, the spy planes, you know, you have satellite communications, the race to the moon, nuclear weapons. I mean, this is just a huge time for technology in the early to mid 60s.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what I found interesting is you can actually watch and find that speech where he's trying to warn us. And it's almost like he's like, people, you need to wake up. And you can find it sometimes on YouTube or other website forums that still have access to it. And that is, if you want to fact check, I mean, it's almost like he's crying out, like, open your eyes.
I was about to say the same thing, and you can almost even see the look of defeat in his eyes, because he knows this is such a gigantic corporation. It's going to be very difficult to defeat.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, you know, a few years later, you get Kennedy, who's given this speech about the secret societies, and, you know, secret societies aren't just the Illuminati, you know, the Knights Templar and things like this. You know, the CIA is probably the biggest society, secret society in the world.
Absolutely, brother. I'm gonna have to agree with you on that one. And you know, a lot of things happened, you know, and while we're on the JFK, you know, and we do always like to kind of tie conspiracies together, I found it very interesting that we know Marilyn Monroe was having affairs with both John and his brother. It's documented. She was on a phone call to a lady, and her name slips my mind right now, but I might throw that up on the board here for you so you guys can validate it and look this up. And this phone call was actually tapped. Marilyn Monroe was tapped because the CIA and the FBI at the time knew that her involvement with them, she might come across some things that she shouldn't. And if she did, would she run her mouth? Well, it just so happens she did run her mouth to this woman on this taped conversation, but it was about aliens and UFOs that she had overheard JFK talking about with another gentleman that we know we've got to get these moved from hangar whatever to hangar whatever. And if she was going to come out and expose this to a reporter in LA, well, guess what? 3 days later, she's found dead of an overdose. That's all I'm saying. And this phone call was recorded and it's validated. And we all know that she supposedly died from a pill overdose 3 days later.
Didn't she also die with the telephone in her hand?
Something to that effect. But I thought that was while we were on the JFK thing, I would throw that little nugget in there for people to kind of think about for a minute. And that's something you can go research yourself and look up. You know, it's just so many different things are tied to it. And people think, oh, when you say somebody was suicided off, you're just crazy. No, it happens all the time. And they've even come out showing that they have things like the heart attack gun, where they can hit you with a heart attack.
Boston brake job, huh?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's crazy. And so kind of when I brought that in, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the 64 election?
Well, one of the things that's important to talk about before we get into the 60s, the 1964 election, is just the whole entire political climate of this time.
Sure.
I mean, you know, there was a lot going on, you know. Kennedy in the early 60s, shortly after being elected, had started his war against organized crime.
Right.
You know, this time's one of the great YouTube videos you can also check out is Jimmy Hoffa and John Kennedy going back and forth at each other at the Senate hearings. I mean, this is absolutely brilliant television. You couldn't write a better script. You know, you have the growth of communism, you know, is starting to approach. You know, now we get into 61, we get with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, you know, the Russians now, this great, big, huge fear of communism spreading throughout the world. You know, they talked about the domino effect. If one country falls, the next country's going to fall. I have a little bit of experience with communism. My wife was born in East Germany, and where I live now in Germany is about 5 miles from the old East-West Germany. So I have lots of museums, lots of festivals every year to celebrate the opening of the East and West Germany. But communism probably wasn't the greatest way of life. Coming from a free America.
Mm-hmm.
But the Berlin Wall was being built, so I mean, this is like in the middle of Europe, so you have communism knocking on Europe's door. You have a lot of things. The civil rights actions were going on, a lot of places in the United States were still segregated at the time,
Oh yeah.
But yeah, the African Americans weren't allowed to drink from the same water fountains, weren't allowed to use the same restrooms, weren't allowed to go into certain restaurants. So there were these very hardcore pro and anti-Castro groups. So I mean, the United States was just a turmoil of political activity in the early 60s.
Right. Oh, and then the Bay of Pigs as well, yeah, in Cuba.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Kennedy got a little bit of a bad name over the Bay of Pigs. He actually did support the Bay of Pigs, and I believe it was Allen Dulles at the time was the head of the CIA, and Kennedy told him that he would only support with air support as long as the initial aircraft on the aircraft landing fields in Cuba were eliminated. Of course, that wasn't happened. This is later chalked up to a miscommunication, of course. But basically, Kennedy didn't give the support, the go-ahead with the air support, because they hadn't accomplished their initiative of disabling the airships in Cuba there. So basically, Kennedy didn't support the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he did catch a lot of trouble for that. A lot of people saw him as soft on communism. So definitely in the South, in these far right political sections, Kennedy was a little bit disliked.
Oh yeah, no, he was definitely, yeah. That's a fact. And I like that we touched a little bit on the civil rights, because a lot of people don't realize how segregated, and more so the Deep South, just here in the 1960s, that we really were. Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, they were holding on to these thought processes, which I'd really never have understood myself as a human. But yeah, it was just, you wouldn't think that it's only been, 62 to 20. I mean, it hadn't even been 70 years ago that people couldn't use the same restroom or drink from the same water fountain or go in the same restaurant. And
Isn't that amazing, Rich?
It's just hard to fathom.
I agree.
And all I can chalk it up to is ignorance. That's it, man. That's what I look at it as. So, and
a part of my job is here in Germany. I'm a language trainer, and one of the things I do is I work with children. And working with children, you get into finding out a lot of information. And I read a nice little study, and it says that basically, if you do not teach your children acceptance and equality, that the human mind is naturally made to be racist. This is a very unfortunate thing. So you kind of have to reprogram your own brain not to be racist. It's very natural to see somebody else and to notice the differences, whether it be skin color, whether it be height, whether it be weight, whether it be religion. I mean, it's different from your perspective. It's different from your belief structure. So therefore, it's some kind of odd or weird or queer or something.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. And I agree 100% with you. It's just, yeah, I mean, we have to work on ourselves and train this, and it takes research sometimes, and understanding, meditation, spirituality, whatever it is that you use on a daily basis. But at the end of the day, we all bleed red. We all think the same. And we're all here to live life and enjoy it. And when people start understanding that, when you can do something as simple as hold the door open for another man, woman, child, or even an elder, that could change their entire day. They could be having the worst day in their life, and for you to hold a door for them and say, here you go, I'm acknowledging you're here, you exist, you're a human being. That could save someone's life sometimes.
No, you're exactly right, Rich. I mean, it's, and the opposite of that is true. The smallest insult or the smallest, thing that you do to somebody that hurts their feelings could be the tipping point for these people to commit suicide, or something.
Right,
You just
absolutely.
never know. So if you know that you have the power to affect people like this, well, why not be positive about it?
Yeah, absolutely. My grandfather told me when I was a child, he goes, words the sharpest weapon that you will ever wield in your life. They're more powerful than a knife cutting your skin, because if you get cut, you can heal from that sometimes, but your words can affect somebody for a lifetime.
You're exactly right. I was with the mayor of my little town the other day and made a nice little joke to him about the pen being mightier than the sword.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So the pen just makes words law. Yeah.
You're right. So where do you want to take it now? You want to move into the 64 election, or?
Yeah, and that's about where we get into now. The 1964 election was much different from the 1960 election. If you look back over time, you see that incumbent presidents are often reelected. Most presidents do get 2 terms. So one thing about the 64 election, though, is that Johnson wasn't as necessary for Kennedy as he was in the 1960 election. Johnson basically carried all of the South as far as the primary is concerned in 1960. And then so 1964, as an incumbent, Johnson probably wouldn't have been as necessary. And it was actually already planned to drop Johnson from the ticket in 1964. He was involved in a very interesting scandal at the time by a guy by the name of Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker was a lifelong assistant and good friend of Lyndon Johnson. And they had, or Baker anyway, had been indicted and was under investigation and possibly facing criminal charges. I never really looked to see what the final outcome of that investigation was. Maybe that might be something for our listeners to look into. But he was basically involved in a bribery for votes scandal. It was anything from money to jobs in the government to sex for votes. So basically, where there's a will, there's a way, and basically at this point in time, your will and your way are Baker and Johnson. There is combined in this, and they're in it together all the way. So basically, this was just starting to be investigated. It was going to come out. This would have absolutely smeared the Kennedy presidential campaign. So he was probably most likely going to be dropped from the campaign. But he did leave him hanging on long enough to take him to Dallas, take him to Texas. Kennedy was going through, I think it was a 4-day tour in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Dallas. And Lyndon Johnson was with him. Governor Connolly met up and went with him. And so they had this nice, Democratic parade through Texas, a get the vote out, MTV had it later on, rock the vote, So basically this is to drum up support, get voters registered for the 1964 election.
Well, and what's odd about that is it makes you wonder, was he forced to go down and do this? Because they could have won the election without Texas. Yeah?
I do think that it probably would have been very possible. Texas in the 1960 election had 24 electoral votes. That's a pretty good amount. I think Texas has the second or third, top 5 population in the United States. So I do think it would have been possible for Kennedy to win without. I think the 64 election for Johnson was a landslide over Barry Goldwater. A lot of people, I think there's still some Goldwater jokes among some of the older generation, about us. Walter Mondale, Barry Goldwater jokes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Mondale, man, I remember that name. And actually
right?
seeing stickers, it's crazy. But so now we're in Texas, and this is leading up to what that fateful day. Yeah. So, would you like to lead in on, where you want to start talking about what we know is true?
Yeah, sure. Basically, we have the Warren Commission report, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But for what's basically acceptable, true, whether we're using Warren Commission reports or we're using testimony from the live television coverage as the event was unfolding, or radio coverage. You had a lot going on in Dallas. So Kennedy lands at Love Field in Dallas, Texas. He's put in a motorcade. 6 people in the motorcade. You have the driver, the passenger, or Secret Service agents. Governor Connolly and his wife are riding in what they call jump seats in the middle of the limousine, and in the back of the limousine, sitting on a little bit of a elevated platform, is John and Jackie Kennedy. They have a designated parade route that they are going to go through Dallas. The streets are just lined with people hanging out of windows, on balconies, waving, greeting the president. Most everybody had a pretty solid reaction, pretty happy to see Kennedy. I think I would probably also go see a president, whether I supported him or not. Seeing a major world figure is, it's quite an interesting thing,
I agree. And then what I found wild too is, like, we won't get into what happened just yet. Jefferson Morley was he was a former Washington Post reporter. He has wrote several books on what he calls the killing. I don't know if you've ever checked any of his books out or anything. But he always goes back to CIA counterintelligence chief, James Angleton. I don't know if you're familiar with that name.
Yeah.
And basically, he says that a lot of the information that he garnered from him that was outside of what he was supposed to say lent him to believe that, something more was going on, because he wouldn't just flat out tell him, but he was kind of like that was his insider. And this guy he had written these books, and he says, when I write facts and truths that I garnered from the inside. He goes, I will never write a theory, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. And he's always tried to make that cry, because he goes, don't look at me as the guy over here who will say, yeah, I'm a conspiracy theorist. He goes, because I'm not. I only get the facts, but yet I'm still considered a conspiracy theorist by everyone. So I just wanted to bring his name up there. If fans are listening, Jefferson Morley. The guy is, he has written some excellent books about JFK, the inside, and the things that happened. And I will list some of those at the end in the credits for you guys. I just wanted to throw that in there before we moved on, before we got into what we were talking about. But so they got the motorcade going on. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Wayne. Wasn't it stated that when the first bullet, the only bullet, first bullet, third bullet, that the governor was hit and the bullet supposedly went through his arm and then hit Kennedy in the head?
Well, let's go back to the facts of what happened there before we start getting into that. That's a really interesting thing there, and we'll talk about that
Right.
bullet. Yeah. So basically, we get to the point to where in Dallas, Texas, is Daily Plaza. So the motorcade passes in front of the Texas School Book Depository and makes a sharp left turn onto Elm Street.
Mm-hmm.
from multiple witnesses' reports, 1 to 6 shots are fired. President Kennedy and Governor Connolly are both wounded. The car exits quickly from Dealey Plaza and drives directly to Parkland Hospital, which was only about 3 minutes away. So they get the president and Connolly to the hospital very quickly. So then a couple of other funny things happened in this timeline. You know, we can kind of look at this whole, what happened in this timeline kind of extends a little bit now, because at, shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we find out that a Dallas, Texas police officer by the name of J.D. Tippett is shot.
Right.
Okay. So then now we have a presidential assassin and a police officer murderer on the loose. Okay. Motorcade rushes away from the crime scene in Dealey Plaza, goes to Parkland Hospital. They're there within minutes of the shooting. President Kennedy dies in the hospital. Sometime later, we have a man who's arrested for the shooting of a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippett. So they arrest this man. We get into the police station at Dallas. We find out his name's Lee Harvey Oswald. And he's taken or investigated at the Dallas Police Department for 2 days, and 2 days later is murdered himself while being transported to the Dallas County Jail. I kind of stuttered through that. I apologize.
No, you're good, brother. Man,
Okay, good. All right.
You don't ever worry about it. Look, we're getting the info out there. And the man who shot him was Jack Ruby. And what we find a little ironic, I say we, most people that delve into this, is his ties to the mafia and the underground. What do you got anything to say on that, Wayne?
Yeah, Ruby's a really interesting guy. You know, his ties, as you say, you know, go all the way back to Al Capone. He basically was a runner for Al Capone, making something like $1 per envelope that he delivered, and these were basically messages between, you know, the mafia back and forth. You know, so Jack Ruby was basically born for this. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit about him later on, you know, but you know, I think, you know, one thing right now is what we can look at is here is after the assassination of Kennedy itself, you know, we get this commission, set up by Johnson himself, you know, with Earl Warren and Allen Dulles. Gerald Ford is on the commission, you know. So basically this is called the Warren Commission's report, and they basically say they do their investigation, Rich.
Oh, yeah, definitely their investigation.
Sure, and you know, their investigation is basically, wasn't an investigation. It was basically the creation of a narrative, much like we have with the 9/11 Commission. I mean, basically, Johnson got these guys together and said, look, we have got to come out with a public statement with proof, an investigation in this case, saying that Oswald acted alone, that there were no foreign or domestic enemies or conspirators involved. And regardless of what the truth is, this is what we have to say and what we are going to say. And towards the end of their lives, you know, people like Johnson himself, Ford, knew that the Warren Commission was not a factual investigation and represented very few factual.
Absolutely. Well, and it wasn't, I think Ford actually even came out, and you can see this now because some of the files were released, you know, from the CIA and FBI. I guess, remember when, what was it, 2017 or 16, Trump said he wanted all this opened up. And I think all of it's opened up except 1% that no one has seen. And then there's like another 11% that is blacked out, and then the rest of it is wide open for your reading. But that where I was going to go with this is that,
you know, you say you know, 1% or 2% or 11%, you know, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of documents in total, you know, so this only 1% is still a very large amount of information.
Right. And the 11%, I actually was checking out. And a lot of it talks about the CIA, FBI assets that are embedded in the media, the news, nationwide and in Dallas and all over Texas. And their job was to, if somebody's narrative didn't fit the narrative they were trying to pitch, you shut them up at any means necessary.
It had a name. It was Operation Mockingbird. Basically, the head of the CIA went in front of a Senate Intelligence Committee and was asked, "Do you have people in media, that are writing and presenting stories for people in the newspaper business?" Yes, we do. Do you have people in Hollywood? Yes. Do these people sometimes present non-factual truths? I would like to answer that behind closed doors. So even at the Senate committee intelligence gatherings, you still don't, really get the whole story, the whole truth.
Right. But it's enough that makes you go, yeah, he wants to say yes, but he's scared, or he's hiding something. But yeah, it's been like that for years. Our media, and when people don't realize that our media is directed to basically guide the people on what to eat, where to buy, where to shop, how to live, and if you don't think that they are doing that, then you're sorely mistaken, because these commercials don't just come out, everything is owned by 4 corporations, and then it goes down from there. I mean, they all own the same guy that, owns Pepsi and Frito-Lay and RJ Reynolds cigarettes and Pabst Blue Blue. It goes on and on and on, all the way down. And then those guys line the pockets of these guys. And the next thing you know, they're pushing their product, saying, this is what you as an American need to be drinking. You need to be smoking, or, eating, or you need to be driving this, because everybody's driving this.
Absolutely. What's the movie? They Live, with Roddy Piper.
Oh man, dude.
Just get your glasses on, and you can see the truth, Rich. It's out there, You just have to look at it with the right eyes,
What's funny about that is, back in the day when TV would go off, they would play the national anthem and the flag would come up.
I remember that.
And there would be subliminal messages popping up so fast the naked eye couldn't see them. So a guy slowed that footage down and analyzed it, and things just like the movie you talked about: obey, love your government, obey, consume. They would flash up.
It's interesting that you say that, because I remember as a kid being in front of the television, ready to turn the television off after it went off. Why did I not ever turn the television off while the national anthem was still playing? Was this the nationalism or the patriotism that was bred into me, or was it? Or the hypnotic trance in front of the television there,
Right. I mean,
that's an interesting point you make there, Something I'd never thought about until the moment you said that,
And it's proven they do that now in some commercials. They'll flash things, or music videos, or things like that. They'll have things flash up that your naked eye is not, but you're catching it. Your brain is recording it.
Absolutely. I watched an interesting documentary not too long ago that was about the brain, how the brain remembers what the eyes perceive, what your brain perceives. And basically they had a group of people doing this big dance up on stage, and then after the dance was over, they asked a couple of questions to the audience. Okay, did you see this? Did you see this? And the question was, how many of you saw a penguin? And nobody raised their hands. And as the dancers are doing their dancer, there's a little penguin that's walking through the group, but you don't recognize him, you don't see him, you're not looking for him, so your brain doesn't perceive him, but your subconscious did. And this is something, this is absolutely what propaganda is about. I mean, I live in Germany, we know a little bit about propaganda over here.
No doubt. All right, well, let's continue on with a little bit, if you want, with the Warren Commission, and then we can maybe dig deeper into Oswald.
Yeah, sure. So basically, like you just said, the propaganda machine comes out and says that Oswald is a lone gunman. He shoots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, 3 shots. Johnson and Kennedy both wounded. End of story. Yeah, no help. That's it. But you know, Oswald for me is by far the most interesting character in this story. You start looking into his past, and you find out, you know, through a lot of research and a couple of interesting documentaries. One of them is the JFK assassination 50 years later. You have the CIA's Oswald Project. There's a lot of interesting information out there available on Oswald. It doesn't really fit the narrative of what the Warren Commission tried to put forth. I mean, as you know, in all of my research, I have yet to find out, to be able to say a reason why Oswald would want to kill Kennedy. It doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, you know, especially if, you know, the Oswald's going to say, oh, well, he was, you know, compassionate towards communism, a sympathizer, and, you know, he wanted to take Kennedy out. But at this point in time, you know, the Kennedy regime, you could call them, you know, the Kennedy presidential team had pretty much already accepted the fact that Castro was going to have power in Cuba, and trying to insert a democracy there was pretty much a lost cause.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you go there with that, and then, you know, there's a lot of things, enigmas about the whole Oswald. Was this guy superhuman? And as you said in the past, was he some superhero who could leap buildings in one leap and fly from Mexico to Connecticut in 1 hour and be in the same place? You know, you want to maybe discuss that a little bit?
Smile and go to this and that and come back over Twitter, read yours with a guy, and damn, I wonder why. Then I think about the past, haven't put it all behind, but you is no longer mine. I don't know what you do with your free time, but I think about you. I don't know what you do with your free time, but I think about you, baby. When you're playing blackjack, when you're out with your girl, when you're taking a nap, I think about you. I've thought every line just in case I run into you. I picture myself, I picture you there, the way we dress, the time of the day, and how I behave. I know it sounds strange, but if there's no work, my mind goes insane. I don't know what you do with your free time, but I think about you. I don't know what you do with your free time, but I think about you, yeah. When you're playing blackjack, when you're out with your girls, when you're taking a nap, I think about you. I know this love thing can be a scary thing, especially when the heart's been broken so many times before. Cause the last time you were asked to trust, all you got was pain, deceit, and all that bad stuff. I need you to trust me, so that one day we two can say we found the love that we always saw another. I know